That's naughty. All right. I'm fresh off vacation. I feel naughty. You guys ready for a message? Okay. Galatians chapter 1. And we're going to be looking at verses 6 through 9. And this is the Apostle Paul writing to churches in Galatia, churches that he himself helped found and start, launch. And these are believers. They love Jesus. They're new believers, but they're going through some struggles. And so he's speaking to that. This is how it goes, starting in verse 6. I'm amazed that you are so quickly deserting him, Jesus, who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another. Only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to a gospel contrary to what we've preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we have said before, I say it again now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you've received, he is to be accursed. I want to take the next few weeks, and this will be sort of a mini-series within the series, because I want to look at one specific theme and take some time, because I think it's worth talking about and exploring. I want to talk about the difference. What is the difference between the gospel and religion? Or I could put it this way. What is the difference between true Christianity and a religious approach towards God? What's the difference? How do I know what the difference is? How do I know if I'm hearing one or the other? And so I want to really get specific and detailed about this conversation. So we're going to take our time over the next few weeks. And like I said, this is kind of a mini-series within the series, but we're going to talk about this. This is really the chief issue here, the core issue that Paul is speaking to, is the pressure that's happening around this community. And they're being pushed into an opposite direction of the way they discovered Christ and the way they were living. And so they're being pressured, manipulated, coerced, and they're stepping into what would be religion. And religion really fundamentally, I mentioned this I think last week, fundamentally religion's not really about God at all. Religion's about me. It's about you. Religion has way more to do with me than it does God. In fact, I would say this, it is a focus and an obsession on my work, the work that I do, as opposed to what the gospel presents, and that's the work that Jesus has done for us. Religion would be an obsession, a focus on my faithfulness, my obedience. So we would sing, instead of great is thy faithfulness, we would sing great is my faithfulness. Christianity, the gospel, is a fixation on his faithfulness, his obedience in our place. Religion would be all about our transformation. But really what the gospel presents is Jesus' substitution. So a life fixated on my transformation as opposed to a life fixated on Jesus' substitution, those are two very different lives. You live them two very different ways. When my wife and my daughter Berkeley moved here, where we were in the process of moving here, back in 2012, we were unloading. We had a house, and we were going to be moving here and living in a little bitty apartment. And so we were offloading sort of everything, and I was taking stuff and donating it. We went to the flea market and sold some things so we could actually eat when we got here. And so we were moving stuff around, and this is before I had a truck. I now have an old, ugly, unattractive, but yet faithful truck. It's me in the form of a truck. No, not very much to look at, but he's faithful. Anyway, so I'm kidding. I didn't have a truck, and so you need a truck to move this stuff around. So my uncle loaned me his truck, which I was very thankful for. And so I'm out there kind of hauling stuff around, and I realize the needle's getting close to the old E. And so I pulled into a gas station, as one would do. And so I just started pumping unleaded fuel into my uncle's truck because that's just the kind you use. And then I realized a couple of, maybe a buck or two into it, oh, wait, this is a diesel truck. This might be the first time he's hearing about it if he's watching online. Sorry, Uncle Mike. So I quickly let go of the nozzle, and I luckily I didn't notice anything bad. I just kind of covered up my mistake and put the diesel in it. So, but we all cringe because the engine, the truck, is designed to operate on a certain type of fuel, and if you put the wrong kind of fuel in it, it's not useful, but worse, it damages it. It can make it, it can break it. It can make it run horribly. And so we, as human beings created by God, are created to run on a certain type of fuel. There's something specific that's meant to fuel us and propel us and cause us to go through our lives doing what we're meant to do. And if you put the wrong fuel, if we partake in the wrong fuel, it's not useful, but worse, it can damage us. As believers, we're meant to be propelled by the gospel of Jesus Christ. We're meant to be gospel fueled. The gospel is yes, it's the fire that ignites our faith, and it's the introduction we have to Jesus, but it's also the fuel that sustains us and propels us always. We don't then switch to a different type of fuel, but when we do, it can be detrimental. And that's what's happening. Paul is watching this community pull up to the wrong gas tank and put the wrong fuel in their car. And he is like, stop, hold on a minute. This is what he says. I'm amazed that you are so quickly deserting him, turning your back on Jesus, who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, a different fuel, which is really not another. Only there are some who are disturbing you, and they want to distort the gospel of Christ. Disturbing you. There are some who are disturbing you. That word, if you go back to the original language, is a word tarasso. And the meaning of that word, the true definition, is to render anxious, distressed, or to perplex the mind, causing doubts. So it's head games. It's manipulating someone's mind, creating anxiety and stress, causing them to doubt, to question. The Apostle Paul writes this in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 13. I fear lest somehow as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, that your minds would be also corrupted away from the simplicity that we have in Christ. It is a similar caution. It's a priority that he has, that we stay locked in on Christ and Christ alone, the gospel. The fear is that we would be corrupted away from that into some other territory, as Eve was in the garden. The deceit in the garden was the enemy, the serpent, trying to get Eve to unlock her eyes from everything that she had in God, and to shift her eyes and her focus to herself. So God made Adam, he made Eve, he made them in his image, and he sustained them, he created everything for them. It was all perfect, it was paradise, and they had everything they needed. They wanted for nothing. It was absolutely perfect. And in fact, God said, you have everything you need. The tree of life is right in the middle of the garden. You don't need anything else. And then there's this other tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the enemy said, hey, if you go eat from the one that he told you not to eat from, then you will become like God. You'll transform and you'll become a better version of yourself. That is a summary of what man-made religion is. It's me taking the reins and transforming myself in order to become a greater version or more God-like when they already were. So the distraction, the deceit was shifting Eve's eyes, ultimately Adam's eyes too, off of God onto themselves. And that's exactly what's happening in Galatia with these churches. They encountered Jesus. They were saved. Hearing the gospel, they believed, and they were saved, and they were free. They were liberated. And now they're turning their backs on Jesus. They're turning their backs on the message, the gospel, which he links. Those two things are inseparable. And they're choosing some other message, some other methodology, some other path. And it's way more complicated. So they're being pulled away from simplicity, as Paul puts it, and they're being pressured into a life of rules, obligations, self-salvation projects. Do this, get that, do it better, advance, change yourself, advance yourself, impress God with your doing. Now, the subtle temptation here, and this is kind of where I want to specifically talk about this today. The subtle temptation and why they were so prone to believe it was they didn't see it as, okay, turn your back on Jesus entirely and embrace this other religion. Because I think they would have been guarded against that. I think most people would. But the temptation was, you can keep your Jesus. You can keep him and his niceties and all the affection you have for him and what he did, but you have to then add to that, you have to add to Jesus the rules, the focuses, the rituals, the principles. So it's Jesus plus other stuff. And so they bought into it. Going back to the Garden of Eden analogy, you have the tree of life, which certainly represents Jesus. It's in the center. It's our source. It's everything we need. It's life. And then you have the tree of knowledge and good and evil. This is the law, in essence. This is life by law. This is you trying to achieve salvation in your own strength. And then what these Judaizers, these outsiders, these influencers are trying to peddle in this community is they're coming in trying to pressure them to basically make a smoothie out of the fruit from both. Just put them in the Vitamix, hit the blend, and you'll get a covenantal smoothie that is perfect and delectable. And they're buying it. They're over there blending away like it's smoothing king of kings. Here's the problem. The gospel of grace and the law do not mix. You can't. It is impossible. Oil and water would be an understatement. They repel each other. There's no blending, there's no balancing. It's one or it's the other. I'd rather you be hot or cold. Lukewarm doesn't work. This is what, we just read this in Galatians chapter 5, verses 3 and 4. Every man who receives circumcision, and it's speaking to the law, but this specific law, every man who receives circumcision, that person is now under the obligation to keep the entire law. You stepped into the category of law, and now that's your covenant. Let me put it this way. My covenant of marriage, you can't also be single. Just let that sit there and marinate for a second. You are in a covenant of marriage, or you're not. You can't be both, because you're going to destroy it all. You can't be kind of, sort of pregnant. No one has ever said, I'm pregnant-ish. You are, or you're not. You're either married, pregnant, you're part of the covenant of the gospel of grace, or you're choosing a different covenant. And that's what he's saying. You're now under obligation to keep all of it. And then because of that, you've chosen another marriage. In fact, there's an analogy given, I think in this very book, where we're talking about being married to the law or married to Christ, and you are severed from the law to join Christ. You're dead to law. But if you walk away from the gospel of Christ, you're severing your relationship with him to be joined to another. You have been severed from Christ, and you're seeking to be justified by the law. Therefore, you have fallen from grace. In other words, when you choose to try to balance the gospel of grace with a little bit of law, you're turning your back on the sacrifice Jesus made to save you, and you're taking matters into your own hands to save yourself. Paul explains to his protege, Robin, to Paul's Batman, in 2 Timothy chapter 2, he says, you have to learn to rightly divide the word of truth. You have to be able to rightly distinguish and divide the word of truth. What is the word of truth? What does that mean? The word of truth is the gospel. Gospel truth. So that is the reality, that is the fuel, that is what leads us and guides us. It's right, I'm not right. When you get to the crossroads of opinion or gospel, gospel is right, your opinion is wrong. We're way more wrong about things than we know, than we realize. The gospel is the truth. That is true north, that is the barometer, that's the truth. So we have to learn to rightly divide and distinguish the word of truth from everything else. So the word of truth from opinion or legalism or religion. This is truth, this is gospel, and this isn't. So I set my course to this, not to that. I was introduced to the gospel accidentally. Back in, I was really giving it some time. We were traveling, and I was on an airplane, and I was sitting there I wanted to get specific to a year. And I looked back in some messages I wrote that I still have on my computer when I was a youth pastor. And my messages changed dramatically once I was introduced to the gospel. I was on staff at the church for a long period of time, and Jesus got a hold of me. And it was somewhere right around 2009. It was probably end of 2008 that this happened. And so I was in a really dark place. My life internally was collapsing. I was imploding. I was not doing good. I was not doing good mentally, emotionally, psychologically. My mental health was worse than ever. I was in a very, very dark place. And I think imploding is the best term I have because it felt like the pressure of everything on the outside was so much greater than what was happening, the substance of the inside, and it was destroying me. I took a break, and my wife afforded me the opportunity to go to a little cabin that my uncle had in Pigeon Forge and just take a few days, and so I could cry and yell and cuss at God. And I just accidentally took a book with me that happened to be, I just had got it, and I didn't really know much about it, but I started reading it, and the whole content of the book, the context of the book, was simply the love of Jesus Christ. And I remember I called my wife. It was probably 1 o'clock in the morning, and which she was really excited about. She goes to bed about 8:20, so I'll watch Matlock later. So so I called her, and I said, "Oh my God," and I was crying. It's all about love. That's what it's all about. This is all about love. And I've been in church my whole life. I'd never heard the gospel presented like that. He loves you. That's it. Never. I heard a lot of lists, a a lot of chores, a lot of to-dos, points 1 through 12. I've heard all that stuff. And I could preach it, and I could recite it, and I did. I was aping what I was hearing. But I'd never heard someone boil it down, distill it to this. Jesus loved you so much that he let humanity beat the hell out of him and nail him to a cross. He let that happen because he loved you that much. Never. And I was like, it's all about love. It opened the floodgates. And I started getting my hands on contraband. Stuff like Ragamuffin Gospel by Brennan Manning. And I was hiding to read it. I'm reading these books that you would think would be banned in the church because it's basically talking about that we don't need your stupid religion. We need Jesus. It messed me up. And then I started talking to my wife about it, and it messed her up too. We were all wonky. It was disorienting. We didn't know which end was up. Imagine giving your life to something, you're 30 years, and then all of a sudden realizing what I was putting, the basket I was putting all my eggs in has a hole in it. Here's this other world. I started talking about it. I started preaching it. I started bringing it up a lot. And I was noticing the difference. I could tell when I was hearing the gospel and when I wasn't. And I realized everywhere I turned, the prevailing message, the predominant message in this world is a blend of both. A little bit of that, a little bit of this. Because we tend to distrust what's said in church. We come to a church, we darken the doors, we sit down, and we're like, that guy who's wearing a goofy shirt and a Miles Davis t-shirt, and my wife told me I look slouchy for church, but that's okay. This is the slouchy church. I buttoned it up, so I looked more buttoned up. But anyway, she's like, you're wearing that? Okay. Good for you. I was like, I'm free, lady. Okay. Maybe you should, maybe you need the gospel. So anyway, I was like, man, I don't know what I was saying now. Yeah, okay, help me. Okay, but we trust what's being said from the pulpit because obviously that guy's not doing it for funsies, and we just start writing it down like, okay, well, that sounds good. That's impressive what he just said. That was a good little turn of phrase. It's like we're impressed by that stuff, and we just trust it. But remember what Paul said to Timothy, you got to learn to divide. In fact, he tells this community, if anybody presents anything other than the gospel, curse that person. That's what he says. And just in case we missed it, he says it twice. He says, curse that guy. Because you're mishandling what God's given you. The pulpit, the platform. You're mishandling it. Jesus goes as far as to call them wolves in sheep's clothing. He says, you'll know them and you'll tell the difference. How? By their fruit. Now, that's not whether they're nice or not as nice, whether they pay attention to you or they don't pay as much attention to you, if he texts you back right away or if he takes a day or two. Sorry. No, that's not the fruit. He goes on to say, listen, you don't get figs from thorns and thistles. Thorns and thistles are the first thing that grew after Adam and Eve fell. When humanity opened the door to sin, the first thing to grow was thorns and thistles. So he's saying that's not good fruit, does not come from the fruits of your labor. The good fruit comes from the fruit of the Spirit. So this whole conversation is to divide, to understand, to distinguish, to know what you're hearing, because what you're hearing is fueling every aspect of your life. I remember I was in a staff meeting when this stuff was happening on the inside of me, and I'm trying to bring it into the mix and introduce it. And I remember we were in a staff meeting, and this conversation came up. A leader in our church said, okay, grace is okay, but you got to balance grace with truth. Which, let me give you a point of reference. John 1:17, the law was given through Moses, grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. So, in that conversation, grace and truth are presented as counterweights. Because grace can get out of hand without tempering it with truth. Now, what that person meant to say, if I can just be so bold, is to say this. The way they're using the words was this: you got to balance the grace with the law. That's what they meant to say. And they were misinterpreting truth as law. So to say you got to balance grace with truth is to say this: you don't want to get out of hand. You got to balance Jesus with Jesus. You don't want to get too deep into Jesus. You got to balance it with Jesus. Because grace and truth, it says here, grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. The original word here, ginomai, which means it came into existence. It wasn't here before Jesus because Jesus is these things. I'm the way, I'm the truth, I'm the life. Paul just said you're turning your back on Jesus as you're turning your back on the gospel. Why? Because that's him. He's the Word. He became flesh. It's him. So you don't balance Jesus with Jesus. What they meant was you balance grace with the law. You can't. One will jump out of the blender. They won't mix. Law is on one side, grace and truth are on the side of Jesus. Law was given through Moses, grace and truth were realized in Christ. We'll talk about the purpose of the law. Did God give the law? Absolutely. And he gave it for a reason, and we'll get to that in the weeks to come. But there's no balance. And here's the problem. There's no control. That's our problem with grace. You don't control it. The law, you can flip the switch on and say, I'm obeying the speed limit. Holy, holy, holy. I'm not stealing. I'm not walking on the grass where it says don't walk on the grass. I'm not doing what I'm not supposed to do. So you can turn that on. And then when it's convenient, when it comes like time to do your taxes, you're like, okay, well, his grace is sufficient. Grace is really scandalous stuff. Grace is dangerous. When the Apostle Paul started preaching grace, he's preaching it to people that really didn't even know legalism, but it's being injected into their lives by other legalistic people. And there was so much fear and trepidation because they were seeing grace as this avenue towards sin. He makes the statement, hey, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. And so if you hear that, you're like, okay, so if I want more grace, I got to sin more? And at that moment, most human beings would let off the gas and say, okay, maybe I'm getting a little too wacky with this grace stuff. But he didn't. He hits the gas and said, okay, you're not understanding it, so you need more grace, not less. Grace is undeserved love, undeserved forgiveness given to an undeserving person by an unobligated giver. It's undeserved love, undeserved forgiveness given to an undeserving person by an unobligated giver. That's what grace is. That's our problem with it. You don't deserve it. You don't earn it. Which means the only way to get in line to receive grace is to not be good. To not have your stuff together. Jesus said, I didn't come for the healthy, I came for the sick. I didn't come for the righteous, I came for the unrighteous. Now, he's not making a declaration that there's two types of people, really bad ones that need them and really good ones that don't. What he's saying is there's bad people that know it and bad people that think they're good. And the bad people that think they're good, they go nowhere near the grace line because you have to actually acknowledge and admit that you're not as good as you thought. The grace line are the people who said, I tried the good line. I tried to be good, and I don't have the goods. Grace is not an incremental pursuit of getting better. Grace is people coping with the fact that they can't. I can't be good. I can't be perfect. I can't be who God wants me to be. Thank God for Jesus. There's freedom in that. There's freedom when you stop feeling the pressure to perform and measure up and name drop and impress and prove yourself constantly. Always trying to kind of pad your resume so people are impressed by you. That's slavery. That life sucks. There's freedom in just saying, I got nothing. Paul said it for a reason. I boast only in my weakness. That's where he brags. Drinking grace straight is a lot. It's strong. And that's why we feel this compulsion to cut it with something, to add a little law mixer or a little law chaser. Because grace straight is powerful, potent, naughty stuff. It feels dangerous because it is. It's like we're putting all our chips in the middle of the table on the hope that Jesus is enough. That he actually covered it all. That his grace is actually sufficient. And that move of putting all their chips in the middle of the table is what I would refer to as faith. Faith is not really faith when you're driving. Faith isn't really faith when you're in control. Faith isn't really faith unless you're trusting Jesus with everything. The vast majority of people, including us, prefer religious maxims as opposed to stone cold gospel truth. We like catchy terms and sayings and slogans, and we like things that make us feel something. Make me feel something. We like chores, we like obligations, we like task lists. Create for me the sensation of forward progress, please. I'm going to read this quote, and we're wrapping up here. This is, again, one of my favorite authors, Robert Capon. And he writes this, I've read this here before, but he writes this mock prayer. And if we're honest with ourselves, this is kind of the prayer that we would pray. And he writes it just to kind of confront us with how we really feel and believe. And this is what he says: Lord, please restore to us the comfort of merit and demerit, earning. Show us that there's at least something that we can do, that we can even in some small way keep some small earning power in our own hands. Tell us that in spite of all our nights of losing, there will be at least one redeeming card of our own. Lord, let your servants depart in the presence of their proper responsibility. If it's not too much to ask, Lord, send us to bed with a few shreds of self-respect upon which we can congratulate ourselves. But whatever you do not tell us about grace. Give us something to do, anything, but spare us the indignity of this indiscriminate acceptance. And drop the mic right there. That is where we are. Human beings live there, in that tension. Just take a step back and look at the self-congratulatory nature of our culture. We can't do anything without taking a selfie and letting the world know that we did it. The grace of God is potent, powerful, scandalous stuff, because it knocks all of our leverages, all of our advantages out of our hands. It puts a discount sticker on the things that we thought was the most valuable part of our lives. Here's my education, here's my income, here's how many kids I got, here's where I live, here's what I drive, here's my resume, here's my accomplishments, here's my name in the headlines. It doesn't matter. And that's when I was in that staff meeting and I heard the phrase, you got to balance grace with truth. The problem was that person had lived their whole life being good, and this is a confrontation of you're not as good as you think you are. And they could not deal. But eventually, every knee's going to bow. Eventually, every tongue's going to confess. I'd rather do it in worship than being forced to do it because I refuse to worship. I'd rather choose that. Obviously, this is not a minor issue. This is not a secondary issue. Paul wouldn't say, hey, anyone that brings a different message is to be accursed. He wouldn't say that repeatedly if this was like no biggie. This is the most important aspect of our lives. Who you marry, extremely important. Where you work, pretty important. What you drive and where you live, those are all somewhat important. There's nothing more important, because this affects everything else. It's a detour to go the wrong way, pursue the wrong message, allow the wrong perspective and message to define us. It's a detour. And it's a detour of false hope. The message, the Christian message, you can do it, try harder, do better. Here's 10 things that you need to do in order to. It creates false hope, because I've played that game. I played it for a big chunk of my life. And let me tell you where it got me. In a cabin, falling to pieces, depressed, broken, hopeless. And I was the one peddling it, preaching it. And it was killing me. There's no pot of gold at the end of that rainbow. It doesn't work. It is the wrong fuel, and it will implode. We don't need good advice. We don't need good strategies. We don't need good techniques. We need good news. We need the good news that Jesus has come and done for us what we could never do for ourselves in a million years. It is finished. That's the good news. Romans 8, verses 2 through 4, I'm closing with these verses. The law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has set you free from the law of sin and death. For what the law could not do, as weak as it was through the flesh, God did, sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh as an offering for sin. He condemned sin in the flesh so that the requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us. It is finished, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Is grace a license to sin? Nope. It's our only leverage over it. Because what grace believes, proclaims, projects, illuminates is the reality that Christ has, the only one who could, fulfilled the law perfectly. And now we're set free. This is not writing on you. I got to sin less, sin less, sin less, sin less. Focus on it, obsess over it. What the Bible says is that law was given that sin might increase. It's gas on the flame of sin. So we think law curbs sin. Do better, try harder. That'll curb sin. We have rebellious hearts. You tell us what not to do, we're going to do it with style, with panache. The only leverage we have, the only good ground we have, is the fact that Jesus was punished for our sin. And now we're free from its rule and control over us. We're free. We're free to be who it is that he's made us to be, to live life in his goodness and his grace, to live life free from the burden of religion, the burden of the law, to live as his children, to live under his grace, and to shine and radiate his love and his goodness everywhere we go. It's a good life because it's really good news. I want to pray. If you would, just bow your heads, close your eyes, and I'm going to take a moment here and just pray.